Hello and good afternoon, TVI viewers. Welcome to CrossRoads with Neethan Shan. As you know, CrossRoads is a weekly talk show dedicated to discussing a variety of topics that are relevant to the social, economic, political, and cultural advancement of Tamil Canadians. May is Tamil Genocide Awareness Month, and we are marking it with a discussion on both the genocide Tamils faced and also the genocide that took place in Rwanda against the Tutsis. We have two guests here, and let me start by introducing them. Ms Chantal Mudahogora, who came to Canada in 1998 as a refugee and has been living in Hamilton ever since. She's a survivor of the 1994 genocide against Tutsis in Rwanda. Chantal is also a recipient of multiple prestige awards for her community engagement, including 2013 Soroptimist Ruby Award bestowed to Women Helping Women and the 2014 People Delivering Excellence Award by the Hamilton Police Services. She's currently a counselor at Alzheimer's Society in Hamilton and Halton. Thank you very much, Chantal, for joining us, and looking forward to hearing you share some of your experience.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And our other guest here is no stranger to the Tamil community, Dr. Joseph Chandrakanthan. He has a PhD from Ottawa, THD, St. Paul. He's a bioethicist in the Center for Clinical Ethics and University of Toronto Joint Center for Bioethics, and associate professor in the Department of Study of Religion at University of Toronto. He is the founding head of the Department of Christian and Islamic Studies at the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka, and was professor of theology at Concordia University in Montreal. His special areas of research and interest include end-of-life care, psychiatry and ethics, spirituality and ethics, ethics and culture, especially Hindu, Saivite, Tamil ethics, and Islamic ethics, international research, ethics in the developing countries. So this is a wide spectrum of experience, and more importantly, Dr. Chandrakanthan also has been an active community member in the Tamil community, advocating for the human rights of Tamils. So thank you very much for joining today. So I want to start with you first, Chantal. Tamils are marking May as a Genocide Awareness Month, and it's important for us to be in solidarity, but also understand other human injustice that have happened, particularly genocides that have happened in other parts of the world. And Rwanda genocide, which you correctly mentioned earlier before you started, should be termed as genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, is one of the examples often cited as a genocide that took place. Though it didn't receive the attention it needed at that time, it's now gotten some attention that others can refer to. So let's start with what happened, because not too many of us know the details of what happened. We know that a genocide took place. Can you take us briefly through what happened in Rwanda?
Yes, thank you very much, Neethan. Actually, in 1994, it's kind of odd because we are also commemorating at this time of the year. The genocide in Rwanda started April 7th, as you know, and it lasted 100 days, so 3 months. And in those 100 days, we lost over 1 million of Tutsis. And also that means when you break down the numbers, at least 10,000 of people were being killed every day. 7 people were killed every minute within those 100 days. So you can only imagine the extent of the genocide. How did it start? Honestly, it goes back in history. As you may know, the history of Africa, probably the history of where you come from as well. Back in 1884, there was a conference in Berlin, in Germany, where the Europeans sit down and they chopped Africa. It's also called Scramble of Africa, and they chopped Africa without considering borders, without considering culture, without considering anything, only because they wanted to colonize Africa. So from that moment, Rwanda was bigger. So when they chopped Africa, Rwanda became a small country, a landlocked country in Central East Africa. We have Rwandan people who have been put after the borders, the new borders from the Berlin Conference, meaning that we have Rwandan people who have been living in Congo, ex-Zaire, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Burundi. However, they are Rwandan with their land, but the borders have been put after them. So we have citizens without citizenship over century, over a century. So that history itself, it justifies most of the conflicts in the region, in the Great Lake region and East Africa. So coming back to the genocide, the colonial system started, and then, as you know, after the First World War, the Germany, who was our colonialist, they lost. So the Belgium came. So with the Belgium, when they came, they started dividing people. They started dividing Rwandans. Back in 1930s, 1933, they started putting identification in the ethnic group into identification, which did not, Tutsi, Hutu, Twa, before that time did not really mean so much. People were being identified as clans. We had about 18 clans in the country. So they started dividing people. They started telling Hutu, oh, you guys are majority, you should rule. Because at that time we had kingdom regime. They said you should rule because you're majority. So they started measuring the length of the nose, the hair height, the facial structure, and different things, the number of cows you owned, like those things to divide people. So we ended up having, in your identity card, you will have ethnic group, Tutsi, Hutu, Twa. So from that point, it started dividing people. They started telling Hutus that they should rule over Tutsi, and there was so much happening and in the history. Then coming in 1959, 1960s, the first actually massacres started. Tutsis were killed. And at that time, we are told by the history that over 100,000 of people died, and over 150,000 of people were forced into exile, meaning in the neighboring countries, Uganda, Congo, ex-Zaire, and Burundi, Tanzania, and they ended up even farther, Kenya, Europe, even in North America. So some Tutsis, few Tutsis remained in the country, including my parents. That's how we had Tutsis outside the country, and we had Tutsis inside the country. So at that time, people who went in the neighboring country into exile, they were under UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Commission. So from their law, you can't be under their support, their help, over 30 years. So coming in 1990s, the Rwandan people have been living in refugee camps, generation after generation, 3 decades. And they've been pleading Rwanda to come back. Rwanda has told them, no, we don't have enough room for you guys. The former regime, Hutu regime, has said there's no room for you. So coming in 1990s, actually Rwandan people from Uganda tried to come back peacefully, and they were killed right at the border. We don't even have the numbers of how many who have been killed at that time. So coming 1990s, they did not have any other choice rather than attacking Rwanda. They attacked Rwanda from the northern of the country. At that time, the regime, the Habyarimana regime, which was a dominant Hutu regime, they planned to kill Tutsis from inside. They started making lists, they started identifying us, but even before then, Tutsis in Rwanda never had peace. Ever since I was a young girl, we were told, when you were in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, we were told to stand up. Hutus stand up, Tutsis stand up. If they tell you to stand up, and some of us did not even know if we were Hutu or Tutsis, because those things were not discussed in our families. So you are just caught in the middle as a young child, and when you stood up, they started bullying you, screaming at you, and you feel like you don't even know who you are and what you are. You are just being targeted for how you were born. And it continues, discriminating us, polarizing us, and calling us names that we are not full human beings. So our parents suffered a lot. They tried to protect us as much as they could, but it's an ideology which takes a root back in those days. So that's why it's not so easy even to approach the ideology today. So how the genocide did happen, it started gradually and slowly, because they even started killing people. They killed Tutsi people in the Bugesera area, which is in the southern of the country. They killed people. They tried different corners of the country before the 1994, just to see if there will be any resistance or anyone in the international community who will come and speak out for us. But nobody came to help. So. So that's a bit of history.
Yeah, no, it's very useful to hear, and there are some parallels to this in terms of colonial past, in terms of divide and majoritarian rule, and so on, right? So what happened to Tamils? Generally, a lot of people know, the older generation know the impact of the war directly. The younger generation that grew up saw the impact of 2009 directly when they organized about the thing, right? So. Traditionally, there is some sort of acceptance within the community that what happened to Tamils is a genocide. And how do you see that? And how does what happened to us constitute to become genocide?
Probably I would say that in the last 60 years, we have gone through a series of struggle, a series of denial of rights, a series of issues which very neatly point out that there has been an intention to deal with this community under various guises. First it was, you're a minority. Then it was a regional division of, North and East, and then the acquiring of the East, for example. If you look back into 1948 or before our independence, statistics would very clearly prove, and there have been studies done, that 98% of those people who occupied the eastern province were Tamils. They were numerically small, but they were all Tamils. But eventually they started bringing in more and more of singular population, and also the Tamils who were there were not only Tamils in the ethnic terms, but they were also Muslim Tamils. Some of them were Tamil speaking Muslims, others Tamil speaking Christians, and Tamil speaking Hindus. Now it took around, I would say, more than last 30 years to arrive at this word, to apply genocide, not as a fanciful word that would make an appeal to the rest of the world, but I think we arrived at this word as a result of concerted efforts to establish that there is substantial external evidence that will point to the fact that, if you, for example, in philosophical terms, if you work from effect to cause, you have the effect and then you try to analyze what causes this effect. And then you will arrive at the fact that there was not only an intent on genocide, there's also actual genocide. Now with that, if you look back, for example, in 1948, the same year in which we got independence was the year in which Genocide Convention took place, and the genocide principle was brought before United Nations. In fact, the one who did most of the work in this issue was a great scholar and a great legal luminary, Raphael Lemkin. Now, Raphael Lemkin, when he defined genocide, he said it's a community which is put in danger, and also a community which is where coordinated actions are made in order to bring them down in numbers, in order to decimate them by violent means, by more powerful elements like the state, for example. And then when the convention was drafted, actually, there were some of the elements which very clearly and very neatly fit in. And that's why we have human rights advocacy groups and other agents who work for the rights of people would clearly state without any hesitation that what happened in Sri Lanka over the last 60 years very clearly point to the fact that there is a genocidal intent, and that was brought into action also. Now, for example, preventing the birth of children within one community. Now, there is substantial evidence, even as recently as 6 months ago in Vavuniya, for example, number of Tamil women who went to have their checkup for pregnancy. Some of the pregnancies were just terminated under false reasons, and who did them were not Tamil doctors. Some of the Tamil doctors, in fact, they said they were either they had to do it out of fear or intimidation, and others did it as a usual thing, saying that it's a defective fetus and we have to get rid of it, and we are doing it right away. This is documented. This is not a fanciful kind of imaginative story. Another instance is, UN Convention would say on genocide says, for example, children of one group are turned into another group and then they are eventually absorbed into that group. Now, there is substantial evidence still even being pressed by a number of young mothers of missing children. And these children were transported. There is evidence given even by singular soldiers. To date, it has not been acknowledged. We may speak of regime change and we may speak of number of good things that are happening, but these children are languishing in someone else's house as slaves or as servants or as domestic workers, or they have been absorbed in some other form, we do not know, but they are not acknowledged as Tamil children. Their names have been changed and most of them were between the age of 6 to 12. Now this is codified by by the UN Convention as an intent on genocide and also an action oriented towards genocide. Now if you look one by one, all that had happened to us, for example, genocide is not merely killing of a group of people. It is decimating that group or causing a total annihilation of that group with a premeditated intention and doing it culturally, economically, socially, politically, familially, in terms of their families, dispersing them or scattering them or shattering them or fragmenting them. It is done also in terms of ethnocide, in terms of infanticide, which we have, I think we have enormous amount of evidence for that. And it's not an emotional push by the Tamils, in fact, but it's non-Tamils and people who have some of the Western countries in which certain groups that still have a humanitarian conscience, they have come forward and made it an issue with substantial proof, with plenty of evidence. And then, of course, in recent years, with the after the Mullivaikal incident, I think that only proved beyond reasonable doubt that intent, which has been carried on successively by various actions, have now been brought to full fruition by total intimidation and disappearance, which we know one of the leading bishops of the country said, okay, you yourself said there were 250,000 refugees in the camps. Now, when we counted the people who returned, there were only 132,000. What happened to the 100,000? And much before that, Vanni had about 500,000 population. These are all recorded. These are not fanciful derivations. And therefore, unaccountability in terms of numbers of human persons clearly point to the fact that they were decimated and they were killed just because they were Tamils, not because they had a different philosophy or not because they had a different faith or not because they profess something that is socially unacceptable, because they were born into a Tamil family. Children were killed because they were Tamils, and some of the children were killed even before they knew that they were Tamils, even before they spoke a word in Tamil. So genocide is in fact, in spite of all these elements, I still feel personally that the UN Convention's definition of genocide is still very ambiguous. But acknowledging what is there already, if you apply all the elements which are implied, which are contained in the Genocide Convention, is perfectly applicable to the Tamil situation. And I don't think there is any doubt that it is not only an intent of genocide, but it is actual genocide.
Okay, great. So that's a good first segment for us to understand what happened to Tamils and what happened in Rwanda to Tutsis as well. We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, there are two things I want to talk towards the later part of the show. One is about the international community and its role in complacency, promotion of genocide, in some ways, participating, either silent partner or active partners in some ways. And then also let's talk about how do we actually do justice to the memories of victims of genocide as a community. How are you doing that with the Tutsis that were impacted in Rwanda, and how do we do that? And how are we doing it with Tamils as well? So those are important things to talk about. Let's take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about those things. Welcome back. You're watching CrossRoads with Neethan Shan. We're talking about genocides to mark the Tamil Genocide Awareness Month in May, and we heard about the genocide that happened to Tutsis in Rwanda and what happened to Tamils in Sri Lanka. So let's talk a bit about the international community. I mean, when all this happened, and you mentioned about how the government tested how much intervention from international community would happen in small scales, and then when there was no interventions, it went full out, right? So how did the international community fail?
One thing I should say is that when you read the 8 stages of the genocide, it's clear that the genocide could have been prevented, even before we talk about stopping it. It could have been prevented, because all the stages that we read with the Genocide Watch, we went through all these stages: the classification, polarization, extermination. Now we are actually at the last phase of denial. So in Rwanda, I was myself a young woman. My first son was 2 years old, and I had just graduated. So I was employed with actually an international agency, which is the International Red Cross, the one in Geneva. And also I lived almost half a mile, or even less than half a mile, from the headquarters of UN peacekeeping, where the Lieutenant Colonel General Romeo Dallaire, who is a Canadian, the former senator, where he was leading the peacekeeping of the United Nations soldiers who came to oversee the peace and try to. We thought they came to protect us, but at the end they pulled out. So the international community. Things happened in their eyes. There was an attempt of a peace agreement which was signed in Arusha, Tanzania, back in August 4th in 1993. Even then, my colleagues from the International Committee of the Red Cross, they told me, they said, Chantal, we don't even know if that peacekeeping will hold, because the minute the former president of Rwanda came back from signing the peace agreement, he just said it was a piece of paper. So we knew very well that they were just doing it to buy in time, to just prepare themselves, and they were just waiting for any type of trigger. So the international community, even before the genocide, it could have been prevented. We had the media, the government encouraging people, training militias, providing machetes. The lists were made. Every Tutsi household had to be identified, and the list of people in the household had to be put on the list. Even the very young child, even the woman was pregnant, they would count that. So the matter of fact, after they killed a family, they would have to go count the bodies to make sure that everybody on the list has been seen. Otherwise, they will go to search for them. The young children, babies, toddlers, actually the children themselves, they did not even cut them with machetes or even shoot them. They would just bang their heads on the wall, and they died there. We still have walls with signs of blood. People try to take refuge in churches, local churches. It's unfortunate that I have to mention that actually church leaders, some of the church leaders were involved, the nuns, the congregations, and actually even the civilians who were members of the churches, because Rwanda was about maybe 94% of Roman Catholic. So there are people that we grew up together who turned around and killed us, and the priests and the other church leaders were actually part of it. And until now, that's part of the international community. Even Rome, Vatican hasn't even said a word, acknowledged it, or even apologized on us. The matter of fact, my own parents at my own village, they were killed in a church. About over 6,000 of Tutsis in my village were killed in that church, because they all took refuge in the church, hoping that they were going to be saved there. So coming back to the international community, it looks like there was a complicity of everyone. Even the UN peacekeeping mission, they pulled out all the experts, all the foreigners. They collect them from everywhere they were located. They will go and they will find, especially in one of the school in Kicukiro, which is a Kigali area, it was a trade school. They went in and pulled out all the foreigners from the school and left tens thousands of Tutsis who took refuge in that school. And then they pulled out all the foreigners and escorted them to the airport, and they left the country. And then the military people, the peacekeeping mission, they packed their stuff and left. So really, if the world, if the powers, if the Western countries wanted to protect us, they could have protected us. But
it's almost like double standard in terms of lives, right? Whose lives is privileged and who,
absolutely. And when you look into the media was also part of it, because they did not portray the real situation which was happening in Rwanda.
And to think that this happened in 1994, it's like it's not like a long history of many decades ago, right?
Not at all. And it's unfortunate to say that even today, with the denial, ever-growing denial movement, we see a lot of media aligning themselves to the genocideers rather than at least being on the side of the victims or even the survivors. And what I'm saying is, if you choose to be a bystander, just continue to be a bystander. Don't come and add oil into a fire.
That's very true. So, talking about the same thing with Tamils, and Tamil's situation spanned for many decades, and international community in some ways were involved, some ways were bystanders. And so, how do you see the progress on this?
Yeah, as the whole genocidal situation was evolving, I would look at it from three different angles. Actually, from could it have been prevented from inside, from internal forces? Could that have been harmonized in some form, some way to prevent it? I think yes, it could have happened. Could it have been prevented from outside, from various groups that were international communities or Committee of Nations and so on? Whether it could have been done, it could have been done also. The third one is whether efforts by the United Nations and associated groups if they have acted more positively, more responsibly, that would have happened also. Now, for internal side, I think it's very unfortunate the church either was indifferent or was a partner even. I am speaking of the church in the south and the west. I am not particularly pointing a finger at the Catholic Church, but also the Christian communities, for the simple reason that it's a community that is committed to fundamental human values, which respects the sacredness of life. For instance, Catholic Church makes big noise about abortions. Now, here were children, here were mothers, young mothers taken in, and they were forcibly aborted. I mean, their fetuses were aborted, and not one single person from the church ever made a noise, except when the Tamil Church made the cry, they said, "Oh, well, this is an exaggeration." They didn't even have the time to go and find whether this is based on reality, whether this is based on truth, whether this can be established, and the evidence can be gathered outside of a person's statement. Now, that effort was never made. There were a number of NGOs that were there, that if they could have worked in a concerted way, they would have also saved thousands of lives. The most unfortunate thing